There's something weird about being a parent. The first moment you hold that kid in your arms, you're in. Like it's all over. You're committed, and you're committed to that kid, and you'll at that moment like I'm stuck. Like I'm gonna do my whole life is about this kid right there, right now. Both of my kids, Lexi and Jackson, they were both born via C-section. And so I kind of had the unique experience of being basically with them myself for their first moments of life. So if you don't know C-section, without getting too graphic, basically they pull the kid out, like show the kid to mom, and then like finish taking care of mom and take the kid away. So with Lexi, I remember I was sitting there for some time, just sitting there rocking her, and I think Jackson had to spend a couple hours, I don't know what they call it, underneath the dome or whatever for his oxygen levels, but still I was there with him alone until mom got finished up. And they were both magical moments for me. And I think something happens in those moments, like this switch was like flipped in my head, where I was willing to do anything and everything for that kid, for my daughter. And I remember one story I remember is like when Lexi was about 3 years old, we had just gotten her in preschool, and she was attending this preschool where she could take a comfort item from home to class each day. And she had this stuffed giraffe that she loved. And she'd go to bed every night with that stuffed giraffe, always wanted it cuddled real close to her. And so one day, I was the one who took her to preschool. So one day we got her up, got her ready, and I took her to preschool, and she had her giraffe with her. And in the classroom, they had this little bin that you'd walk in, and you'd put your comfort item in the bin, and then she'd spend the day with her class. Well, the only thing was, in the afternoon, they had a less structured time, and they spent most of the afternoon in the gym at this place. And so when I came to pick her up that night, I got her, picked her up, and guess what we forgot? The giraffe. Yeah. So later that night, we're trying to put her to bed. Karina's home, and like she's having none of it. Like she needs her giraffe, and we're trying to give her like some other like comfort item or what are those little things? The loveys. None of it. She didn't want anything. So fortunately for me, this was a night Karina was home. She wasn't working. So I was like, well, let's just go for it. So I jumped in the car. I drove down to the preschool, and it just so happened her preschool was a preschool that met in a church, and I was fortunate there happened to be worship practice that night, like 8 o'clock, 7:30, 8 o'clock at night. So I walked in the door, walked to her classroom. It was wide, the door was open. Not good practice probably by them. And sure enough, there was her giraffe, and got the giraffe and brought it home, and whew, it was all saved. It was all good. But like parents will do anything for their children. I remember when I was a kid, my family had a 1984 Dodge Caravan. Anyone remember the Dodge Caravan? Back in the day, man, those things were like, that was like the pre-SUV of SUV. Like those were so hot. We had a 1984, and if you remember on those Dodge Caravans, they had like, do you remember like the back windows? Like I don't know how to they like kind of prop open a little bit. Like they didn't roll down, but they kind of like you prop them open. So I don't remember how old I was. I had to have been like 6 or 7. I had my little toy car, and I was playing like on the ridge, if you can imagine, on the back window, as my mom's like driving down the streets of New York City. That's where we lived back then. And somehow, I don't know if she hit a bump or whatever, but my little car, fell out the car into the street. And I'm like, Mom, my car. And would you believe it? She pulled over, middle of New York City, stopped the car, went out into the street, and got my toy car. I need to call her up and thank her for that, don't I? Yeah. My dad, mind you, tells a similar story. I had to give my dad some love here. I feel like gotta give him some love. So I don't really remember this. I'm not sure how old I was, but back in the day in New York City, my dad was a pastor in New York City. Back in the day in New York City, the Yankees, I don't know if it was both the Yankees and Mets, but in this case, I think it was the Yankees game, would give out free tickets to clergy, to pastors. So my dad, being a pastor, He got a couple tickets for a game. I don't know if he knew what was happening or whatever, but the game he happened to take me to was Glove Day. Now, I don't know if how many are here baseball fans, but one of the things that I think to me, that's just goes with baseball games is the giveaway days, right? Like there's days you show up to the park, you show up early, and they give you like a hat or like a towel or some cheesy thing. And my dad loves those free items. Like a couple of years ago, I met him for like Father's Day and I took Lexi, and I'm like, Dad, don't worry. Like, we don't need to get there that early. They're giving out like 30,000 of these stupid hats. So sure enough, we get there, and we got there late. I felt so bad, and he'd missed out on his hat. But so this day, it was baseball glove day for the kids. So we get there, and I don't remember this, so this is the story he tells. But he gets there, and all the kids they're passing out all the gloves to the kids. And I guess they see my dad's ticket, and it's like a clergy ticket. And they're like, hey, you didn't pay for this. You don't get a glove. So if you can imagine, like, I'm standing there, like, little 5 or 6-year-old me, like, seeing all these kids get gloves. And, like, my dad's trying to figure out how to explain to me, like, oh, you don't get a glove, son. So I would not envy his position if I had to do the same to Jackson. So I guess, quickly after as he could, he went out and bought me a glove to solve that problem. But I mean, this is what we do as parents for our children. We'll do anything for our children. And, maybe you're here, you're like, hey, I'm not a parent. But, maybe you're an aunt, you're an uncle, you're a grandparent. Maybe you got some younger brothers or sisters. Heck, even if you got some friends with them kids. I can't believe that if your little niece or your grandchild or your little sister or brother came up to you with those puppy dog eyes, that you wouldn't fall all over yourself to help that kid and do whatever you could for that child. And if you don't have a child in your life, like, you need to find a child to get in your life. Do it legally, of course. We're all for that. But I mean, I got to believe there's some like organization or school or something, nonprofit you can volunteer for to have a child in your life in some capacity. Because as much as I dramatize being a parent, and if you spend enough time around me, like, yes, I dramatize being a parent a lot. Like, there's something incredible. Like, there really is something incredible about having children in your life. And I don't know if it's like their sense of wonder, their energy, their love. I mean, it's just, we all could use the goodness of a child in our life. I mean, even this morning, while we're like 7:30 in the morning, while we're sitting out in the parking lot, Lexi's like, Dad, we should start we should start a climate change website. I mean, so I bet if you're here today, you've experienced that at least in some capacity. And I bet the first time you held your child again, whether it was your biological child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew, whatever, I bet the first time you held that kid, that child, you knew you'd do whatever you could for that child. And I imagine those feelings that stirred within our own hearts, those first time that we interacted with our child, are the same stirrings, those same feelings that stirred within the heart of Joseph, the adoptive father of Jesus. The first time he held that little baby Jesus. And again, if we remember according to the Bible, Joseph was not Jesus' biological father, right? There was the whole virgin birth thing. But regardless, Joseph was committed to that new life, and he had done whatever he could to take care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And I'd bet that first time he held the little baby Jesus in his arms, he knew, no matter what, no matter the circumstances of the conception, he knew that this was his baby. He was his child. And he was going to do anything and everything he could to take care of that child. And of course, if we remember the circumstances, Jesus was no ordinary child. There was the whole thing around his birth. And in this time of year, after we celebrated Jesus in the manger, we talk about the Magi, the wise men, these people who come from afar, they see the star, and they find the little baby Jesus. And if you remember the story, they ask Herod, who's the ruler of that part, said, "Hey, we saw this star. We think there's somebody special being born. Can you tell us about it?" So they Herod doesn't know, so he goes. The Magi go and they see Jesus and they give him the gold and frankincense and the myrrh, if you remember. And then they're warned in a dream not to return to tell Herod, but they go out and sneak out the back way, I guess you'd say. So Paul is actually going to talk more about Herod next week. So I don't want to steal his thunder, but let's just say for now, like, Herod was not a good dude, and definitely did not want the best for that kid. We'll leave it at that for this week. Paul will give some more next week. But let's pick up the story, kind of give you the 30,000-foot view. But let's pick up the story. I'm going to read in Matthew chapter 2. You're welcome to follow along either in your own Bibles or on the screen behind me. But we're going to read Matthew 2, chapter 13. So again, this follows right after the wise men had been warned in a dream not to go back to talk to Herod. So it starts out, again, verse 13, when the Magi had departed, an angel from the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod will soon search for the child in order to kill him." So Joseph got up during the night, took the child and his mother to Egypt. He stayed there until Herod died. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet, "I have called my son out of Egypt." So this week we're starting a new series called Unheard of. We're looking at this familiar story, the story of the birth of Jesus and what happens immediately after the birth of Jesus, the infancy of Jesus, we might say. And we're looking for, or rather, we're trying to listen for some voices we might not have ever heard before. Because sometimes it's those stories, it's those voices, it's those perspectives that we've never heard that oftentimes have the most to teach us. And most of the time, those are the voices that we need to hear. I mean, in 21st century life, there is so much noise. I mean, every day is just another torrent of information, like coming down our throats, overwhelming our ears and our mind, from TV to the internet, to social media, to newspapers, if anybody still reads newspapers. There are so many things competing for our attention. There's so many different voices trying to be heard that either we just find it all to be inaudible noise, or we only hear the loudest, strongest voices. And the problem is when we only listen for the loudest or hear the loudest, and when we can't decipher from among the noise, we often miss out on those voices that we really need to hear. And Joseph is one of those voices that we really need to hear. And I know that might come as a surprise to some, because when we think of Jesus or Joseph, like, we don't really think of him as that being that much a hard luck guy. I don't know if you've seen the commercial, this Wix commercial, where this guy's like talking about Wix and he's this bike shop owner. I don't know if you've seen that commercial where he's got his bike shop and he's got this beard and he's got this flannel and he's building his website talking about bikes. I think, like, in 21st century America, or at least especially in 20th century America, like, this is who we think about when we think of, like, Jesus. Like, he's like this, like, upper, like, this middle class white guy who's got, like, he started out just like making some furniture in his garage, right? And then, like, he started making some custom furniture for, like, his friends, and then somehow, like, evolved into this, like, business, and it's like this full-time business. So we think of, like, Joseph as this, like, this middle-class white guy living in the suburbs, with his own custom carpentry business. And I think that's what we think about a lot of times when we think of Joseph. But the reality is Rather, Joseph was this poor, migrant, low-income Middle Easterner. And being a man of limited resources, when a threat came to his beloved family, to his beloved child, he did the only thing he could do. He ran. And he took Mary and the baby Jesus to the strange land, Egypt. Now, the past week, and maybe it's been 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, social media changes like overnight to the next controversy, right? But whether it was last week or a couple of weeks ago, there's this big kind of, all this talk on Twitter at least about, was the baby Jesus like technically a refugee? And there's some people who are like thinking, Mary and the family that traveled to Bethlehem, thinking that was what the refugee thing was about. And then there's other people who are like, Rome was technically part of the Roman Empire, or not Rome, Egypt was technically part of the Roman Empire, so it wasn't really, they're just like doing like cross-country travel. And I don't know whether or not Jesus would fit the 21st century definition or United Nations definition of what a refugee is. In my opinion, at least, in the opinion of people a lot smarter and more educated than me, the Holy Family was a refugee family. Jesus was a refugee. And I think when we start to understand that, when we think about Jesus and the family in that perspective, and that really, it changes everything. And I think when we understand Jesus, when we understand Joseph's family in that light, we begin to hear Joseph's voice in a new way. Perhaps we can imagine Joseph awaking suddenly in the middle of the night in a start, or perhaps, springing out of bed early in the morning, trying not to disturb the little baby. Or perhaps we can imagine him trying to say in hushed tones to Mary, hey, we need to get up. We need to get going. And trying not to wake the baby. And we can imagine Mary's confusion, like, what's going on, Joseph? Had not the Magi just visited? Like, I just finished arranging, the gold and frankincense and myrrh, like in the nursery. And Joseph, didn't you just put together the crib? Like, what's going on? And now, in the wee hours of the early morning, she's trying to make sense of these words that she's hearing, and her mind's got to be spinning out of control. What is going on? And while we can't go back in time and hear the harried voice of Joseph as he tries to rouse his family from slumber and rush out the door before soldiers appear on his doorstep, I think we can hear Joseph's voice in the Syrian, fleeing a years-long civil war conflict in his own homeland. I think we can hear Joseph's voice in the Central American father who says to his teenage child, I love you, and sends him off on his own, alone, in hope of a better life for his son who he loves. I think we can hear Joseph's voice in the Mexican father who leaves his family in Mexico, travels across a long, empty, dry desert in hoping to find a job that he can send money back to his family. But to hear Joseph's voice, I think we really have to listen. I think we have to listen above the constant stream of distraction and entertainment and voices. I think we have to listen through those voices of anger and hatred and racism. And I think we have to listen through the commotion and anxiety of our own heart. But I think if we really listen with our own ears and our own hearts, we would hear Joseph's voice in our heart and in our mind. We'd remember those times we saw our little kid, our little baby, our little niece, our little nephew. And we remember those moments that we knew we'd do anything for that kid. So here, this is the thing, I think. As much as as much as Americans or white Americans think about Joseph as this middle class carpenter dude, I think a lot of times we as Americans, at least as white Americans, we identify as kind of like the heroes of the story, as maybe Mary and Joseph, when in reality, we probably have the most in common with someone from Egypt. I came across this poem the other day, and I want to read it. And I quote, "If I were to figure out who I am in the gospel story, I would not say I'm Joseph. I'm at best some random person in Egypt living in a land of safety while those outside flee to something I get by chance. So I think about how unwilling I am to face this worldwide reality, and I wonder, what would have happened if Egypt would have blocked Joseph at the border?" As powerful as those words are, I'm not so sure we need to wonder. Because I think in many ways we see it happening in our world. We see it in the face of the Syrian migrant as he readies his family in a little life raft to voyage across the sea. We see it in the tears of children separated from their families, sleeping on cold concrete. We see it in the eyes of migrant parents as they're reunited with their children. And as powerful as the words of that poem is, I think it might, if anything, maybe stop short. We can imagine what might have happened if Joseph was stopped at the border, because, it's what's happening at our very own border. And I think if we stop for a moment and listen to our own hearts and our own mind, we'll hear Joseph's voice in the voice of those crying out today. So I think we've got to listen, to really listen to those unheard of voices, those unheard of people. Because I think when we listen for those voices, we'll hear the voices of the Holy Family, of the Father Joseph. So I think really the choice is ours. When some desperate family comes knocking, Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus, they were a desperate family. How are we going to respond? Are we going to hear in Joseph's voice the voice of our own, who would do whatever it takes to take care of our own child? Or are we going to hear the voice of the callous, the careless, the cold? Which voices will we listen to? I invite you to listen to those voices